Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the 10th State Senatorial District Candidate Forum. I'm Suzanne Hewitt from the League of Women Voters, and not a resident in this district. I live in Wrightstown. The League is a nonpartisan organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. This forum is part of our ongoing voter education efforts to help voters make informed decisions in the upcoming election. We do not endorse candidates or a particular party. The purpose of this evening is a job interview for our two candidates, Marguerite Quinn and Steve Santarsiero. As citizens, you are their employers, and these candidates are your prospective employees. They are applying for a 4-year job of state senator and make policy decisions in Harrisburg that will directly impact your lives. After evaluating the candidates' answers and positions on issues and compare them with your personal values, we hope by the end of the evening you will have a better idea whom you prefer to hire on November 6th to represent you in Harrisburg. We ask you help make this a productive evening of civil discourse and comply with the audience guidelines sheet you receive when you arrive. Please silence your cell phones and turn off all the electronics. To save time for the many questions as possible this hour, we are asking that you hold all applause until the end of the forum. We are counting on you to be a polite audience. Tonight's agreed-upon format begins with each candidate giving 1 minute opening statements. Then we will proceed with question-answer portion. I will ask a question. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond. Then they will have an opportunity for a 30-second rebuttal. In the event of emergency, please notice there are 4 exits, 2 down front and 2 in the back. So, of course, we hope we're not going to have to use those, but be aware. I think we're ready to go. We had a drawing this morning, and we decided the order of the candidates speaking. Marguerite Quinn will go first with her opening statement. Then Steve Santarsiero will proceed. He will take his closing statement first. So we're going to start with the candidates giving 1-minute opening statements. Marguerite Quinn.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you to the League for hosting this and to Delaware Valley University for allowing us access to this great room. Thanks all of you for your interest in democracy, and thank you, Steve, for participating in this. Welcome to the 143rd Legislative District. I've had the privilege and pleasure and honor of serving this district right here for the last 12 years. 12 years ago, when I first ran, I promised the people of the 143rd that I would deliver to them every day integrity, hard work, accessibility, and honesty, and I have done that. I have worked across the aisle to deliver bipartisan results. I have worked among geographic differences in the states of Pennsylvania to deliver effective, pragmatic legislation and unparalleled constituent service, and I couldn't have done that without the help of an effective staff. I've listened, I've delivered, and I'm willing to take that to the next level and serve as your next state senator.
And Steve.
Thank you, Suzanne. I want to thank the League for hosting tonight, for Del Val opening up this auditorium for us. Marguerite, I want to thank you for participating, and all of you for coming out on a Thursday night to hear what we have to say in this debate. We are now about 5 days away from what I think will be the most important election in all of our lifetimes. In 5 days, it won't just be our names on the ballot. What you're going to be asked to decide is whether we're going to move forward on issues like gun violence prevention, whether we're going to move forward on issues like protecting the environment, whether we are going to move forward with making sure that all people in our society can enjoy the same freedoms and protections together. These are the issues that are on the ballot on November 6th, make no mistake. I look forward to having a vigorous discussion about all those issues tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. First question from the League. Marguerite, this will be your question. It's on gerrymandering. Citizens want to end gerrymandering and have fair voting districts, but legislatures have different ideas about how to do so. Would you support having an independent Citizens Commission be responsible for both state and congressional redistricting? And please address what role, if any, the legislators should play in the redistricting process.
I do support having a Citizens Commission draw our legislative boundaries on a state and congressional levels. In fact, I am a co-sponsor of the Fair Districting Bill, House Bill 722, that has been in the House all of this session and possibly the previous session. I have stood up against my Republican leadership, against Chairman Darrell Metcalfe, when he finally allowed this bill to come out of his committee, but did so in a fashion that basically thumbed its nose to those people who support the bill. I believe that the role of a legislator in supporting this is just exactly what I'm doing. You know, working towards legislation that allows the people to choose their legislator as opposed to the politicians to choose those who they want to represent.
Thank you. And Steve, your thoughts on gerrymandering and the drawing of those districts?
Yeah, I think gerrymandering is honestly one of the biggest problems that faces our democracy today. It's one of the things that really undermines our ability to have effective government at every level. Now, I support an independent citizens commission, but what happened this year in Harrisburg is instructive on this issue. Because what happened was they had that bill, and then the House amended it to make it have the legislature basically have a say in ultimately what would happen with the districts. And so they took a good idea and turned it into something that actually was anti-reform. And I point that out because so much of what we're going to be talking about here tonight and what's going to be in front of you on Tuesday is whether we're going to have the status quo where that kind of thing happens, or whether we're going to have a change in leadership in both the House and the Senate to make sure that we actually get real reform and real change. It hasn't happened with the Republican leadership in either the House or the Senate, and we need to change it.
Marguerite, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I do. Steve, I just have to correct you on the record. The House did not amend that bill. That bill was amended in the State Government Committee under Chairman Darrell Metcalfe. That bill in its present form never came in front of the House for a vote. Had it come in front of the House for a vote, I would have voted against it. We had much discussion in our caucus room about that bill, and there were over 750 amendments that were put on that bill. It never came up for a vote. Darrell Metcalfe was wrong. My leadership was wrong for not bringing it up for a vote, and I've put them on notice, letting them know that. Notice meaning saying it.
And Steve, do you have a chance to respond to that?
Well, whether it happened in state government or whether it happened on the floor, it still happened in the House. And the bottom line is that the Republican leadership was responsible for that. Darrell Metcalfe is the Republican chair of the State Government Committee. We are never going to see meaningful change in Harrisburg until we change the leadership, and that's not going to happen if we continue to elect Republicans in seats like this. We need real change. We need people who are going to demand that we in fact have reform on issues like gerrymandering and campaign finance and a host of other issues.
Thank you. And Steve, second question is going to be on campaign finance reform. Pennsylvania ranks 43rd in the country in terms of its campaign finance limits on donors, special interest groups, and corporations. If elected, would you co-sponsor legislation in Pennsylvania to enact campaign spending limits and support increased penalties for lobbyists who do not abide by the lobbying disclosure law?
Suzanne, absolutely. I've done it in the past, and I will do it again as a member of the state Senate. But I want to tell you, we need something more than limits on what can be contributed to a campaign. We need to have limits on what campaigns can spend as well. I mean, part of the problem that we have, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the United States, is a system where more and more money goes into these campaigns and more money is spent by these campaigns, most of which has absolutely nothing to do with informing voters about where candidates actually stand on the issues. So I think if we're going to do real campaign finance reform, yes, we need to make limits on the contributions. But we also have to have limits on what the campaigns can spend, because if we do that, that will really go a long way in reducing the influence of money. The other thing we need to do, by the way, is we need to overturn the Citizens United decision. And I know we need the U.S. Supreme Court to do that, but short of that, the U.S. Constitution needs to be amended. And that can happen one of two ways. Either Congress can propose an amendment, or the state legislatures together can do that. And I've proposed a bill in the past about that, and I will do that again because I think we have to get rid of Citizens United. It is a major problem and is having a real deleterious effect on money in our politics.
Thank you. Marguerite, campaign finance reform?
Yes, thank you. I would absolutely support campaign finance reform, and in a previous session, I actually was part of a bipartisan caucus, for lack of a better word, in the House where we discussed this, and we had different pieces of legislation in front of us to see what could be done, what should be done. I mean, let's face it, right now we have 2 millionaires, multimillionaires running for governor. It's a matter of who could spend the most to get that primary endorsement when each of them were relevant. I support, like Steve, the campaign finance reform, but also on the spending side. And I encourage my constituents, or anyone for that matter, before they give to a candidate, to look at where the candidate's money is coming from and look at how the candidate spends their money. And Steve, you've certainly brought in a lot of union money this session, this election cycle, and have plenty of money to spend on that.
Thanks. Steve, did you have anything to add?
I certainly do. Yes, I've been supported by organized labor because I stand with working men and women who have fought for so many things that we enjoy as workers in the United States today. But the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of my donations have come from individuals, and the majority of those from individuals right here in Bucks County. And no, I mean, I haven't gotten a lot of checks from corporations and the Chamber of Commerce, but that's the difference between Democrats and Republicans, I suppose.
Marguerite, you get another chance to?
No, I don't have a response.
Okay.
I mean, you know, this is just Steve being political. Political. Let's just have more rhetoric and let's move on with the next question and get some policy and some substance into this discussion.
Okay, we'll move on. Okay, Marguerite, this is your question. If SCOTUS overturns marriage equality, would you introduce legislation in the Senate to establish marriage equality in Pennsylvania?
I would definitely support marriage equality in Pennsylvania. I don't know that I would be the one to introduce it. I would probably be beaten to it, but I would certainly support it. When I first ran for office 12 years ago, in the middle of my campaign, or at the tail end, I got a call that my brother-in-law, Patrick, died suddenly. And it was Patrick's husband, Marty, who called me. An hour later, we were still reeling with the news. And Marty called back to say, "Are you going to come and identify his body?" I said, "Why not you?" And he said, "I don't have that right here in Pennsylvania." And it taught me right then and there something I never thought of. Patrick and Marty did not have the same basic protections that John and I had. I've been a supporter for a long time of LGBTQ rights, and I will continue to be that. And I dare you to try and look into my heart and soul and tell people that I don't support this. Like everyone in this room, we have family members, loved ones, neighbors who are part of this community. They're part of our community. They're part of my heart, and I don't have that prejudice.
Thank you. And Steve, how do you respond to marriage equality?
Well, in a heartbeat, I would offer that bill. As the brother of a gay woman who, back in 2008, had to travel to California to get married, to marry the woman she loved, when she couldn't do it in Texas where she lived, I understand on a personal level how this has impacted our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ community. It's a personal issue for me. But Marguerite, I'm not saying you're prejudiced, not at all. But the fact of the matter is, when the PA Fairness Act, House Bill 300, back in 2009, came in front of the State Government Committee for a vote, you voted against it. Now listen, most people may not understand this, but right now in Pennsylvania today, there is no law preventing a landlord from discriminating against a gay person because they're gay. We need to have protections in Pennsylvania. The Fairness Act would do it to protect LGBTQ people when it comes to public accommodations, employment, and when it comes to where they can live. That's just a basic thing. And every person in the legislature should be in favor of that. And that bill should be brought up today and should be voted on. But again, the Republican leadership in the House and Senate refused to bring that bill up, and that needs to change.
Marguerite, do you have anything to add?
Steve, if you were to read the transcript from that meeting back in 2009, that voting meeting was the first state government committee voting agenda when I was on that committee. There had been 7 statewide hearings the previous session. We got the testimony at my request at 10:30 the night before on those hearings. I couldn't possibly digest all of the information in time for the 10 o'clock meeting. I asked for a hold. I spoke to Babette Josephs, asked her to hold off the meeting so we could actually get our arms around it, because once again, I was going against leadership and I wanted to support that bill.
May I respond?
Yes, you may.
You don't need to read transcripts to know what's right. You don't need to read transcripts of some hearing to know that LGBTQ people have the same rights as the rest of us, and that needs to be in Pennsylvania law. I'm sorry. If you wanted to vote for it, you should have voted for it.
I like to know what's in a bill.
If I may finish. I think everyone knew what was in that bill. It was pretty clear. The only thing it did was add to our existing law, which prevents discrimination on the basis of race and religion. It added LGBTQ to the status of those
Thank you.
protections. That's all.
Let's move on to the gas severance tax. This is going to be your question, Steve. Should Pennsylvania fall or other states enact the gas severance tax?
That's to me.
That's the question, yes, for you.
Yes, absolutely. We are the only state in the union that has not enacted a natural gas severance tax. We have a robust natural gas industry in Pennsylvania in the Marcellus Shale region. That's going to continue on for decades, because after they're done extracting gas from the Marcellus Shale, they'll start extracting gas from the Utica Shale, which is beneath that. They are extracting a natural resource here in Pennsylvania. And they should pay what they pay in every other state. They've already factored it into the price of natural gas. The idea that they're somehow going to leave the state if we impose the severance tax is nonsense, because the gas is here and they pay it everywhere else. And by the way, Pennsylvania could use the revenue. Our schools could use the revenue. We could use the revenue to help pay down the pension debt. There are lots of things that we could do with that revenue. And if we had enacted it back in 2010, I believe, when it first came up, we would have today billions of dollars of revenue that we don't have because that tax was not enacted.
Marguerite, how do you feel about the gas severance tax?
I voted in favor of the gas tax under, you're correct, 2010 when Governor Rendell was there. Months later, when Governor Corbett gave his budget address and talked about what he would not do in terms of a gas tax, I went directly to our appropriations chairman and said, we've got to come up with something. I worked for months on an impact fee. Fee, not a tax, because that was the only practical thing that this governor said he would do. From that time until now, from when that was enacted, we have brought in $1.5 billion into Pennsylvania's coffers from that. I have voted again in support, or I've been positioned, I've been put on a in-caucus team to try and get a severance tax to the floor to vote. However, I did stand on the House floor last year, argued about a severance tax that came over that the Senate and Governor Wolf approved of. Because that severance tax, in order to get those dollars into Pennsylvania, we were going to have to roll back critical environmental protections, critical environmental regulations, and I am not about to sell out our environment just to get more money in. We need to up our severance tax. We have a tax in place now that has an effective tax rate, that impact fee from 2.5 to 8.7% over the years that's been in place. Could we get more money? Should we get more money? Yes, but not at the result on the back of the environment.
Thank you. Steve, did you have another comment?
Sure. Well, again, this is another example of where the Republican leadership in Harrisburg doesn't make the right thing happen. Both with respect to the impact fee, which is, by the way, actually somewhere between 1% and 2%, and therefore far lower than what a severance tax would bring in. And most of that revenue, by the way, goes to the areas where the drilling takes place. We don't see quite as much benefit of it here in the Southeast. But also with respect to what Marguerite's talking about, that bill that came out of the Senate in the summer of 2017, while it had a severance tax in it, was a horrible bill for the environment and should have been voted down.
Marguerite, did you have everything to add?
I'm glad that Stephen agrees with me. I wish he'd been on the House floor talking about with me what a horrible bill that it would have been for the environment, but we were able to defeat it. And I will say, with that 2% rate right now, that's because it's a function of the lack of gas that's being produced. When and if that production ever comes back up to speed, we will have that at a higher, but hopefully then we'll have an authentic severance tax in place. The question will be, is it on top of the impact fee? Is it in place of the impact fee? And that's where we have so many geographic differences that we have to speak through.
Thank you. Marguerite, this is for you now. What will you both do to protect a woman's right to make decisions about her reproductive health? Will you protect the right for a woman to have an abortion?
I support the law of the land, and right now the law of the land is Roe versus Wade. Personally, I am pro-life. I vote pro-life with the exceptions of life, incest, and rape.
Okay. And Steve?
I have
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought
finished.
you were done.
I have visited Planned Parenthood right here in Doylestown when I was first elected. I have a lot of respect for the work that they do for our underinsured, for our uninsured. They're providing women's health services, and I have been public in my caucus room and in outside. I'm a member of a women's health coalition, a bipartisan, bicameral coalition in Harrisburg. And I've said I will not defund Planned Parenthood, yet I do not want to see taxpayer dollars going towards abortion services.
Steve, reproductive health for women?
Well, I'm proud to have been endorsed by Planned Parenthood in this race because of my support of women's reproductive rights and the work that Planned Parenthood does quite apart from the issue of abortion. But Marguerite, the truth is, 10.5 months ago, you voted for Senate Bill 3. Senate Bill 3, the most restrictive abortion bill in the country, that would have banned abortions even in cases of rape and incest. So I hear what you're saying tonight, but it doesn't square with the record. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we have to safeguard a woman's right to choose and women's reproductive rights. And I support that. And I believe, at the end of the day, that Planned Parenthood does a great service for especially poor women on a variety of medical services. But that's the record.
Marguerite, did you have a comment?
Sure do. Steve, that bill did not restrict abortions in the case of rape or incest. That bill had been amended in the House. I believe it was an amendment 3215 that did just that. What that bill did was to stop tearing an infant apart limb by limb as the primary cause of death. It stopped D&E as the abortion method, as the death method. It made it necessary that before you took a pain-capable being and ripped it apart by the limbs, the death was killed by another means.
Thank you. Steve, you have another comment?
Well, you're simply wrong about Senate Bill 3. It would have banned abortions without exception for cases of rape or incest, period.
Okay, moving on to the legislators. Do you think legislators should be paid during a budget impasse? And that's for you, Steve.
I don't. And I had a bill, I think it was House Bill 1572, that I abided by back during our last budget impasse in 2015. And basically what that bill said was, while there is a budget impasse, legislative pay should be suspended. And then after the budget is passed, the pay would be given. And the idea behind that is to put pressure on legislators to come to the table and get the budget passed. Now that year we had a 6-month impasse. A 6-month impasse. Think about that. During that time, schools were not getting their funding from the state. Critical services for the state were not being funded. And the legislature was just sitting back and letting it happen. We weren't even in Harrisburg most of the time. The leadership of the Republican Party just decided that they were going to be at loggerheads with Tom Wolf. And we had to wait until January of 2016 before a budget was finally passed. So I think that that legislation makes sense. I will introduce it again as a member of the state Senate. I think it would go a long way in decreasing the length of these budget impasses.
Marguerite, how do you feel about the legislators being paid during the budget impasse?
Steve, I think you're setting up a situation where basically you're not allowing someone who's a working class family like myself to do what they need to do as a legislator to protect their constituents. I'm not wealthy. Congratulations if you are, but I'm there to do a job. And that last budget impasse was going to put an $8 billion tax increase on the constituents of Pennsylvania. And for me to say, no, I need to get my paycheck, or am I going to stand up and fight for what's right, which is exactly what I did. Steve, you voted for all those taxes. You voted again and again. And then when the opportunities came in the summer, when the governor did not he did a complete veto when he could have line item, we in the Republican caucus brought up item after item: school funding, critical service funding, rape crisis centers. You had an option just to vote for them, but instead you held out. I don't think that I am not going to be beholden to my leadership and their decisions in my household. I don't think that the legislature should be made up of people who can afford to just sit out until the legislative leaders come together. I go to work every day. I do my homework. I come to the table with constructive ideas. That's what I'm paid to do. I'm not paid to just say, cave and take what they want, cave what the governor wants. I'm there to represent you. And because the people in the 5 counties here in the Southeast contribute over 50% of the revenue for Pennsylvania, I'm going to protect your pocketbook.
Steve, do you have a comment?
I do. Listen, this is about rank and file members putting pressure on the leadership to do the right thing, and not caving, but compromising. They ultimately got to that point 6 months later. It could have happened 6 months sooner. And if everyone felt a little pain, just like our school districts were feeling that pain, guess what? That would have happened. We are public servants. We are public servants. If we're not getting the job done, then no, we shouldn't get paid. And I didn't take my pay during that time. You did. And then you criticized me in this campaign for having done that. Well, I think it's the right thing, and I think it would get these budgets done much more quickly.
Another comment?
Steve, I didn't criticize you for that. I criticized you for taking your pay during the 2009 Rendell budget impasse, when we were there until October 9th or October 12th. I wasn't going to criticize you for that when I knew I took my salary, and I took my salary then based on a court ruling. But no, I was criticizing you for the other one. You took your paycheck, you didn't cash it, but you took your paycheck.
Moving along, Marguerite, do you think it's feasible for the state of Pennsylvania to commit to a goal of 100% renewable energy?
I am a co-sponsor of that bill. Representative Chris Robb from the Mount Airy area has that bill. I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. I'm also the prime sponsor of House Bill 1446, which will encourage, through building an infrastructure of Pennsylvania, the use of electric vehicles. So yes, I am a supporter of that. To be honest with you, I don't know in that time frame that it's feasible, but I think it's certainly a goal that we could go towards, and a goal that's worthy of our trying to achieve. I say I don't believe it's feasible because during budget appropriation hearings of this year, I'm on the Appropriations Committee, I asked Secretary of DEP, Patrick McDonald, if he thinks it's feasible, and he kind of chuckled and said, no, I do not. I have that on legislative record if anyone cares to see it.
Steve, do you have a comment on the feasibility of committing to 100%?
Well, let me just say that I think when the history of our era is written, historians are going to look at the issue of global climate change as the most critical issue. Because when you think about what the consequences can be if we don't act and act quickly, mass disruption of populations across the globe, whole areas that are now producing food no longer doing that, oceans rising, cities being inundated, it's a serious, serious problem. Now, 8 years ago, we were trying to increase the renewable standards in Pennsylvania for wind and solar. We still need to do that. Whether we can get to 100% renewable by a particular time remains to be seen, but I think what we need to be looking at is how we cut greenhouse gas emissions in Pennsylvania to meet the targets that are necessary in order to really reverse the trends of global climate change. And it's not something that Pennsylvania can do alone, obviously. We all need to be working to make sure our federal government is leading the charge on this, and not just complying with the Paris Accord, which unfortunately the Trump administration doesn't want to do, but even going beyond that, because the latest report out of the UN is that this issue is much worse than we thought it was before.
Thank you. Marguerite, did you have a comment?
I agree with Steve. That's why I've actually introduced legislation and got it out of the Transportation Committee. I did get it stalled in the House. I did not get it brought up for a vote. This is an example of not just needing to work in a bipartisan fashion, but needing to work in a regional fashion. We have people with whom I sit in a caucus room who literally said, I'm ridiculous with my bill. It's for Quinn's Tesla driving people in Bucks County. They don't get it. I'm out to continue to try and educate them about the needs of what we have to do for our environment and that we must be acting now.
Steve, did you have another comment?
For the record, I don't drive a Tesla.
I didn't mean you.
But again, and this is part of the problem, we can't even get this legislation brought up. It won't be brought up with Joe Scarnati and Jake Corman in charge in the state Senate. It won't be brought up and hasn't been brought up with Mike Turzai as the Speaker of the State House. We need change in Harrisburg if we're going to make progress on issues like this. And these are critical issues. They're critical issues, and we're wasting time. We need to change.
Speaker Turzai supported the bill.
Well, you didn't bring it up.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, this is for you on education. Will you vote against any budget that cuts funding for K through 12 public education and/or our state colleges and universities?
Absolutely. As a former teacher, I understand all too well what an important role funding is in our schools. You know, the fact of the matter is the state used to, on average, pick up about 50% of the funding for our K through 12 schools. Now that number is down to about a third, and that's an average. Here in Bucks County in our 13 school districts, in most cases, it's even lower than that. So we need to do a better job, first and foremost, to help our schools, but also to help our local property taxpayers, because when the state picks up a greater share of school funding, then our local schools don't have to raise the local tax as much because they're able to get that funding from the state. And so I think it's a critical responsibility. It is one of the biggest responsibilities the state government has, is supporting education. And I I hope we can talk more about it later, but we really do need to go beyond just what we're doing with our K through 12 and our state universities. We also need to be expanding job training and early childhood education as well.
And Marguerite, how do you feel about the budget for funding for K through 12?
I feel, just as I voted, that I am most supportive of education funding. Funding education is an investment in our future. I will have to say, though, Steve, you just said you'd never vote against it. You did, in fact, in the 2009 and the 2010 budget, when you voted with Governor Rendell and with the colleagues across the aisle to take the federal stimulus dollars, to ignore the warnings that President Obama did, and you put that money straight into the education budget, taking state dollars out of education to fund bureaucracy. 2 years in a row at $1 billion each. Then Governor Corbett came in and we were light the money. We had to go deeper and deeper and put more state dollars than ever into education because the federal dollars that we knew would go away went away. What a surprise. We knew it was coming. I wrote my school districts, make sure you know that this money is not going to be there again. And it was a mistake. You voted for it. It was gone right there into bureaucracy. And I will not vote to take money out of our schools.
Steve, did you have a comment?
I sure do. That's tortured logic at best. The fact of the matter is the 2009-2010 budget funded basic education not by a figure of $9.8 billion. In 2011-12 budget that Corbett and Marguerite voted for, that number went down to 8.7, $1.1 billion in cuts. And if you don't believe that's the case, talk to the school superintendents here in Bucks, and they will tell you what they had to do, cut programs and raise taxes. It was not a good deal for our school districts.
And Marguerite, you also get a chance to comment.
Well, thank you. Steve, we could disagree on this, but the numbers and the graphs and everything out there, if we were able to bring some paperwork like that, I'd have brought it and it would have shown. That was $1 billion of federal money that we knew was going away, and it was misplaced.
Okay, moving on to another topic. And Marguerite, this is for you on drug prices.
On what?
There is inaction on the federal level to take on the issue of reining in drug prices. What is your position on state-driven efforts and legislation to address big pharma price gouging and influence?
Well, as a member of the House Insurance Committee, actually the vice chair of that committee, I've had the opportunity to sit on different hearings where we've tried to discuss this. What I find it's very interesting, I'm able to bring this home often because I can visit not far down the street from here, the Pennsylvania Biotechnology Center, where we have seen investments of drugs, dollars invested so that we can bring cures to market. We have seen with so many pharmaceutical companies around us abandon their research because of the cost of that investment, the cost to bring the drug to market, and then them not being able to get recouped for that because of the patent law going off. I think that when we talk about the cost of healthcare, we must keep the drugs as part of the conversation. So often we've talked about the three-legged stool with the consumer, the provider, the physician, and the insurance companies. We must have the drugs and the drug companies who are profiting well beyond the cost of investments, part of that discussion, so that state investment, public investment, federal investment into these come into market, that we're able to afford it, quite frankly. These companies have some responsibility. They have a civic and they have a moral responsibility to make the drugs affordable.
Thank you. And Steve, how do you feel about reining in drug prices?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the point that the pharmaceutical industry puts a lot of money into research and development, and they've got to be able to recoup that when they sell the drugs. I get that. But the fact of the matter is that consumers are being gouged. And we need to make sure that prices are lower. Now, you know, one of the problems is allowing Medicare to be able to negotiate to get drug prices lower, and that's something that has to happen, Medicaid as well. And it's, you know, it is good. The House took a step recently for seniors who are low income by increasing the threshold for the PACENet program, and that's helpful. But at the end of the day, we have to hold the pharmaceutical companies accountable. You know, these drugs, no one should be making a choice between whether they're going to be buying food or buying a necessary drug because the prices of the drugs are so ridiculously high.
Marguerite, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, we talk about the pharmaceutical companies and the price of drugs. That's just not the only place we should be looking. I had a bill pass. It was a really big bill, House Bill 1466, a couple of sessions ago, when it dealt with drug pricing in the workmen's compensation arena. And we found that there were third parties and direct dispensing of drugs from our physician's office that were actually costing that system on some drugs up to 700%. We put a stop to that.
So did she.
And so did she.
Steve, did you want to have a comment?
No.
Okay. Put a stop to that.
That's right, exactly. There you go.
Well, we haven't put a, well, let's talk about marijuana. Steve, it's your turn. Do you support legalizing marijuana for recreational use?
Not at the moment. I think the jury is still out on that. The great thing about our federal system in the United States is each of the states gets to be a laboratory for experimentation on different issues. And right now we have a number of states, some of our neighbors, that are legalizing marijuana for recreational use. I would like to see how it plays out in those states before we consider it here in Pennsylvania. I did support and I voted for the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. I think that's been very helpful to many people who suffer from chronic pain, and that was the right thing to do. But I'd like to see how this plays out in some of these other states before Pennsylvania were to take that step.
And Marguerite, how do you feel about recreational marijuana?
Like now? Like Steve, I am not supportive of this. The biggest argument I hear towards it in Harrisburg is to bring in the revenue. And, you know, by the same token, I go into my next meeting and it's about the opioid issue. And when I've met with family after family and talk about the tragedies that they've witnessed in their families, it typically goes back to the first access was alcohol, something in the medicine cabinet, or marijuana. I am not about to try and make this move, especially without seeing what we have these laboratories happening now in Canada or our neighboring states throughout the nation. Let's see what happens there before we just go after a money grab that could be a very expensive issue here in the Pennsylvania in cost of human life and addiction. I did vote for the medical marijuana. I've recently had an opportunity to sit with a friend who is battling cancer, and it just amazed me to hear firsthand. It made me very proud that we as a legislature did get that passed to see what a difference this is making in her life. And I've heard many stories and had thank you notes from people who shared their stories about what this does. It was the right move. I'm glad we worked together on it.
Steve, did you have another comment?
No, thank you.
Okay. Well, you touched on this, but we'll have a question on it too. Marguerite, here is the opioid epidemic. There is a prescription drug abuse epidemic. What would you do to combat it?
I would continue to do what I'm doing right now, and that means education, 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 and some laws. We have made some major steps in Pennsylvania with our prescription drug monitoring program, with, I just mentioned, my physician's dispensing bill. It literally stopped physicians and third-party distributors from getting paid to distribute opioids. I had another bill where we stopped, we're now catching in real time purchases at our pharmacies all throughout town, like here we have 6 or 7 pharmacies, stop in real time the purchasing of the Sudafeds and such that are just used to make drugs. This gets very personal. I go to my father's grave, and right next to that, I see this beautiful, tall marble gravestone, and it was a young woman here from our local high school that died with her first use of heroin. It's something that we know we cannot arrest our way out, we cannot legislate our way out, but we must all beat down the stigma and understand that this is a problem that crosses socioeconomic lines, race, gender. I don't care where you live, this could be coming your way. We have made great steps with having our doctors realize they must pull in their prescribing abilities. And I do support Matt Weintraub here and some of the municipalities who are saying, hey, let's look to see what, if any, false advertising has been done by our pharmaceuticals.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see any daylight between Marguerite and me on this issue. That legislation, as she talked about, especially with respect to being able to monitor what the prescriptions are, is absolutely critical. You know, this is a problem that began because of the over-prescription of opioid pain medication. And it has ravaged our community without regard to socioeconomic status. Every community in the 10th District, every community in Bucks, every community in Pennsylvania, and for that matter, the United States, has been impacted by this issue. Right in my own area, we've had this issue. We've had tragic results. And I think that we need to continue to make sure that we're cracking down on prescriptions. And that, frankly, again, getting back to the medical marijuana, I mean, that offered an alternative for pain management that did not lead to opioid abuse. And I think that's a good thing as well. But we have to make sure that our treatment centers have appropriate funding. We have to make sure law enforcement does. And at the end of the day, this is something where all of us in the community need to understand we have a stake and a role to play to help turn the tide on this issue.
Thank you. Marguerite, did you have a further comment?
Really just a public service announcement. This Saturday, we had the Drug Take Back Day throughout the county. I was able to be with Matt Weintraub for a little bit at the local Kmart, and it's just amazing. Bucks County leads the state. I believe collectively here in Bucks, we have pulled in more drugs out of our medicine cabinets than the rest of the state combined. That's important because what's sitting in there, it leads to drug diversion, and too often we just don't realize that that could be dangerous and sold out in our community. So that was my public service announcement.
Thank you. Steve, do you have an announcement? No. Okay.
No public service announcement. That's okay.
I took the words out of your
Well,
You did.
moving on to another subject. And let's see. This is, Marguerite, this is for you. Do you think school districts should be prohibited from allowing teachers to be armed? Prohibited from allowing teachers to be armed?
I will not vote for school districts to be armed. However, I live in a district where our school districts basically have like a 3 to 5 minute response time. We don't all throughout the Commonwealth, throughout all of our 500 school districts have that. I remember this year, Governor Wolf was given a speech saying, I think it should be a local option. I never want to see our teachers armed. I never want to see that they have to be armed. But if there is a school district that has no municipal police force and has a half-an-hour response time from the state troopers, I want them to be able to decide what it will take in their community to keep their students safe. That's not something that's sitting here in Doylestown with the state troopers, with municipal police forces, regional police forces, that I want to decide for another part of the county. I have representatives who have districts that cross hundreds of miles. I don't know how much police force they have there, and I don't want to make that decision for them. But here where I live, I can guarantee that I do not believe that we need to arm teachers, and I will vote against this when it comes, if it ever comes up.
And Steve, how do you feel? Should districts be prohibited from allowing teachers to be armed?
Yes. I don't think there's any place in the state of Pennsylvania or anywhere else in the United States where we should be arming teachers. And frankly, the argument that I just heard proceeds on the false assumption that if the police can't get there fast enough, somehow having teachers armed is going to make the situation okay. Introducing more guns and guns in schools does not make the situation safer. It makes it more dangerous. We should be providing more security in our schools. There's no question about that. Making it harder for people who should not be in the schools to get into the schools in the first place. There's no question. But we should not be arming teachers. If we have a problem in some rural parts of the state because they don't have police forces and they don't have state police close enough by, then we need to solve that problem. I mean, because that's a problem that goes beyond the schools, frankly. You can have crime occurring in a whole bunch of other places where if the police response time is not good, that's a problem. So we need to be dealing with that head on as that specific problem, not by allowing school districts to arm their teachers. That's just crazy.
Marguerite, do you have a comment?
Sure, I'm glad we agree on that, because I said I would vote against it. What we did just do in this past budget is put $60 million in. It was a new initiative for school safety, and I believe that those districts that are in difficult positions or not as advanced as some of the schools that we have right here, with putting new doorways and single access entrances, they're going to be applying for that. But again, we come down to an issue here with guns that's on mental health in many ways.
Okay, thank you. Steve, do you have another comment?
Yeah, but the question was whether school districts should be prohibited from arming teachers. There is a district in Tamaqua right now that just passed a resolution at its school board to have its teachers armed. And the residents in that district are understandably upset. I think Harrisburg has to tell these school districts, no, this is not in furtherance of public safety. It's dangerous. And if there's a problem with getting local police to where they need to be, we're going to solve that by making sure we have the resources there.
Okay. Moving on to another topic about manufacturing. And this is going to be Steve. Manufacturing is an important part of the economy of the greater Delaware Valley and Pennsylvania. Please speak to what you will do to support, improve, expand manufacturing in Pennsylvania.
Well, it's a great question. I think what we need to be doing with our state policy, our state fiscal policy, is providing tax incentives for those industries that are here and those that want to come here to provide a manufacturing base. You know, the Keystone Opportunity Zone in Fairless Hills at the old U.S. Steel site for many years was very successful in bringing manufacturing jobs into the area and providing good jobs, good paying jobs at good wages. That's the kind of thing we need to replicate throughout the Delaware Valley and, for that matter, throughout Pennsylvania. It's also important that we continue to invest our infrastructure because investing in infrastructure is something that attracts businesses to locate and stay in our area. And again, it gets back to education as well, because good schools is a key ingredient to making sure that we have businesses that come here and set up shop and expand here. And that's true both in manufacturing and for that matter, in white-collar jobs as well.
And Marguerite, how will you support, improve, expand manufacturing in Pennsylvania?
Well, we have to make sure that Pennsylvania's tax policies say we are open for business. And that not just being open for business, but that we want to retain the businesses that we have here now, the manufacturing businesses. When I visit the local manufacturers, and this time last week I visited a very successful one right up on 611 Tyndale. It's great to see what they're doing in there. When I visit them, what I'm told is that one of the biggest problems is attracting a new workforce. We've just invested in this year's budget $30 million towards career and technical education. That's something that we must continue to do. The 4-year degree is great if there's a job at the end of that 4 years for someone. We have to rethink how we're educating our students. I remember years ago, my mother said, don't bring another thinker in this house. I want an electrician, a plumber, someone who could actually do something. And while we laughed at that, there's a truth. We have so many skills that we are not educating them for. And some of it, I'm told, is that they need people to pass the drug test. It goes around and around on this, the skills and making sure that people are job skill ready, not just knowing how to do it, but they know what they need and the responsibilities ready to take that job and perform as their employer expects. So I believe that investing in our career and technical education is going to do an awful lot to support our manufacturing efforts from the ground up.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, you have an opportunity to add that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think job training is critical. One of the things that we do really well right here in the Southeast, and in particular in Bucks County, our community college does a great job partnering with the private sector in providing training that helps the needs of those companies. That's something that should be expanded and replicated throughout Pennsylvania. The other thing that's very beneficial to us here in the Southeast, the building trades have excellent apprenticeship programs that train these plumbers and electricians and provide them with the skills to have a great career. And I think we have to expand on that as well and make sure we support those programs.
Okay. And Marguerite, you have a chance to make another comment?
That's okay.
You're good, okay. Let's move on to another topic, and we're going to start with you, Marguerite. Did you support Pennsylvania's decision to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act?
Quite frankly, I'm not sure I had the opportunity for that vote. I don't believe that vote was ever brought up in front of us. I did and remain supporting the having our under and uninsured get insurance. But Steve's probably going to tell me I'm wrong on something, that I did vote for whatever, but I don't believe we ever had that up for a vote. I remember a procedural move on the floor by Representative DiGirolamo. So if you asked if I did, that was how your question was phrased. You know, here's what I do in the healthcare industry. I'm the vice chair of Pennsylvania's Insurance Committee. I'm the only member from Pennsylvania, the House or the Senate, that's a member of the National Conference of Insurance Legislators. I joined that in 2009 when the Affordable Health Care passed in DC, and everyone in the House and in the Senate was just making noise about it. And I said, it's time to roll up my sleeves and learn about it. I traveled the country funding myself to attend these conferences and to find out the good, the bad, and quite frankly at that point, the unknown about the bill. We have to do a better job with our whole healthcare system. We need an element of personal responsibility. We need to get the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers out, pull back the curtains and see who's standing and holding hands with each other back there. So we're delivering the services that are needed here in Pennsylvania.
Okay, and Steve, did you support Pennsylvania's decision to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act?
Yes, I did. We were very frustrated during the Corbett administration because former Governor Tom Corbett did not support that. And thankfully, Governor Wolf, when he took office in 2015, one of the first things he did was expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, and that wound up ultimately ensuring an additional 700,000 or so Pennsylvanians who didn't have access to insurance before that. What happened was, in the summer of 2013, the Pennsylvania State Senate took, every year when we pass the budget, one of the bills that has to get passed is the Welfare Code bill. And this Pennsylvania State Senate amended the Welfare Code bill to include Medicaid expansion, and basically all the things that would be necessary to expand Medicaid in 2014. The bill came to the House, and that provision was stripped out of the bill in the House, and then the bill was voted on without that provision. And all of us on the Democratic side voted no because we were, and we discussed it on the floor, we knew what was going on. 2 Republicans voted no as well. And I want to give them credit. They're both from Bucks County, Gene DiGirolamo and Bernie O'Neill, because they also knew what was going on and that this provision was being taken out. And as a consequence, the people who were eligible for the expansion had to wait another 1.5 years before that happened. And that was a tragedy, and it was also a huge economic loss for the state.
Marguerite, did you have something to add?
Well, it might have been a huge economic loss to the state at that time. I'm glad that it was caught up, but we do have to face the reality that as that expansion rolls out further, the state is going to have that money. So we will be coming back looking to see how we're going to make up the money once the federal government pulls back that money, the seed money that they put in for it to originally start.
And Steve, you have an opportunity for a comment?
So when we talk about the cost of these things, it's really important that we remember what the cost of inaction is, right? Because when people don't have health care coverage, whether it's Medicaid or private insurance or whatever it might be, their primary care physician becomes an emergency room. And ultimately, that costs us much more in the long run than what we put toward a program like this. So I'm proud to have supported Medicaid expansion. It was the right thing to do, and there are many more Pennsylvanians today benefiting because of it.
Okay, thank you. Steve, this is for you. Pennsylvania has one of the largest general assemblies. Would you support a decrease in the number of legislators?
Yes, I would, I did, and I will. It is far too big. You know, frankly, the House at 203 members, it's really too big. I mean, there was a bill, I was a sponsor and voted for this bill several times. Initially, I think it brought it down to 153, and then it brought it down to 151. There was a proposal to reduce the Senate from 50 to, I think, 38. I think both of those ideas are fine. I think, frankly, we could get more done with fewer members. No offense to my former colleagues. But the truth is, it's too big, and it's expensive, and I think we can cut that down. Now, unfortunately, we had an opportunity just this past summer, and the bill got deep sixed, and that's too bad, because had it passed this time, as it had in the last session, it then would have gone to the voters as a referendum. And I'm fairly certain, I'm not going to speak for all of you, that if you had to vote on this in the ballot box, you would probably vote in favor of it. And unfortunately, now we're going to have to start from scratch because it wasn't passed in this session.
And Marguerite, how do you feel about reducing the size of the assembly?
I could walk out my house, turn right, go down 4 houses, and I'm in Bernie O'Neill's district once I cross Edison Furlong Road. To me, if he absorbed my neighborhood, if I absorbed his and others, it wouldn't make a difference in my vote. For those reasons and many others, I voted in support of reducing the size of the legislature on several occasions, as recently as 2 weeks ago when this bill was brought up and it did not pass. Unfortunately, it was stalled. There were hundreds of amendments on this bill, most of which, Steve, I hate to say, were put on by colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle to kill the bill. And there were a lot of concerns about, you know, how the districts would be drawn. I think it's a part of that is just a distrust with the gerrymandering, that people don't know what the end result would be. So I really see this as something that goes hand in hand with the gerrymandering discussion to make sure that when and if we take the step to reduce the size of the legislature, we're making sure that those decisions are being made by a nonpartisan, independent commission, so that we're not just reducing the size and making, you know, somebody else happy. And again, the whole gerrymandering discussion about who's picking these constituents, who's making up the makeup of the actual legislative districts.
Steve, did you have another comment?
Yeah, when it comes to both reducing the size of the legislature and gerrymandering, it's a pox on both their houses, frankly. Both Democrats and Republicans are complicit in this because it has more to do with incumbency than anything else. And it's the same issue with respect to term limits. Like, I support term limits, but a lot of these folks who have been out there for years don't. And this should be, it gets back to a fundamental point. This should be about public service, not the other way around.
Marguerite, did you have a further comment?
No.
Okay, good. Okay, then we're going to go to Marguerite now. Why are Pennsylvania's roads so bad, even with a major increase? What will you do?
Why are Pennsylvania's roads so bad? Well, many of our roads were built when we weren't driving these big vehicles out there. Some of these roads and our bridges were built for horse and buggy. We've got more streams than any state other than Alaska. That adds to the thaw freezing process because we're in a climate that has a lot of that. And we've seen it exceeding the normal winter months at times. I voted a couple of years ago for what's now called Act 89. It was the largest transportation funding bill ever. I was a member of the Transportation Committee then. I still am. That is bringing many, many needed dollars into our road and bridge infrastructure. A budget ago, we addressed another problem that's been just sucking the money out of the transportation, our road and bridge money, and that's the pension problem with regard to the state police. They have been getting 75% of their operating budget out of the motor license fund, and the system is just not sustainable for that. We put a cap on that, and we're going to be weaning the state police further off of that budget. But this comes down to money. It comes down to money, and it also comes down to a problem that we have with prevailing wage on jobs. We have to pay for when there's any public money in the job, we've got to pay prevailing wage. It inflates artificially the cost of this work, and it means basically a third less of the miles are being done or potholes than would be otherwise.
Okay, and Steve, your thoughts on the roads?
Well, I too voted for Act 89, and Act 89 is now pumping $2.5 billion a year into our transportation infrastructure and mass transit. And so when you drive around and you see roads being repaved or train stations being redone, it's because of that revenue and that vote. And that involved a tax increase. So we both voted for a tax increase. And, it was a bipartisan effort under a Republican governor, but roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the House voted for it. And I could have not voted for it. They had the votes otherwise. But I voted for it at the end of the day because it was the right thing to do.